The shield wall breaks. Not slowly. Not with warning. One moment it's holding. 300 Englishmen locked shoulder to shoulder, spears forward, faces set with grim determination. The next moment, it's collapsing like a wave crashing against cliffs. Bodies fall. Blood sprays across frozen ground. And through the gap pour Viking warriors, axes swinging, voices roaring battle cries that sound like thunder mixed with wolves. This is Ashdown. January 871 AD. And England is dying. The young prince fighting in that shield wall, the one desperately trying to hold his section together as men fall around him. His name is Alfred. He doesn't know it yet, but he's watching his world end. Within months, 3 of England's 4 kingdoms will belong to these invaders. Within years, he'll be hiding in swamps like a fugitive, the last king of the last free English territory, with nowhere left to run. But right now, in this moment, he's just trying to survive the next 5 minutes. The question everyone should be asking is, how did it come to this? How did farmers from frozen Scandinavia conquer the richest, most powerful kingdoms in Western Europe? And why, when faced with overwhelming force, superior numbers, and home field advantage, did the English keep losing? The answer isn't what you think. This isn't a story about savage barbarians overwhelming civilized Christians. This is a story about strategy, psychology, and one simple truth: the Vikings understood something about warfare that their enemies didn't. They knew that terror is a weapon. That reputation matters more than numbers. That if you make your enemy afraid enough, you don't have to fight them at all. They just surrender. But understanding how they conquered England means going back. Before the battles. Before the invasions. To the moment when a handful of raiders realized that the richest prize in Europe was completely undefended. June 8, 793 AD. The island monastery of Lindisfarne sits peaceful in morning mist. Monks kneel in prayer. The sea is calm. Then, dragon ships. Dozens of them, appearing like ghosts from the fog. Within an hour, the monastery is burning. Within 2 hours, the Vikings are gone, their ships heavy with silver and gold, leaving behind only bodies and smoke. England's reaction tells you everything you need to know about how unprepared they were. The scholar Alcuin wrote that this attack was impossible to comprehend. Divine punishment, surely. No human army could strike with such speed and vanish so completely. The churchmen prayed. The kings sent messengers to each other, promising to strengthen defenses. But they didn't understand what they were facing. This wasn't an army. This was a business model. For 70 years, the pattern repeated. Summer raids. Coastal monasteries. Trading towns. Anything near water, anything with wealth, anything poorly defended. The Vikings would hit at dawn, take everything valuable, and be gone before any army could respond. They weren't trying to conquer. They were testing. Learning. Mapping every weak point in England's defenses. And what they learned was devastating. England was rich, divided, and completely unprepared for their style of warfare. See, England in the 800s wasn't one country. It was 4 kingdoms: Northumbria, East Anglia, Mercia, and Wessex, all Christian, all supposedly allied, but in reality, constantly bickering over borders and power. When Vikings raided Northumbria, Wessex didn't send help. When East Anglia burned, Mercia watched from a distance. Each kingdom assumed the others would handle it. Nobody handled it. And in Scandinavia, warriors were taking notes. They saw kingdoms with churches full of silver, farmlands producing surplus crops, towns with no walls, armies that fought in predictable formations during predictable seasons. And most importantly, no navy. England's kings had spent centuries fighting each other on land. The concept of defending coastlines hadn't even occurred to them. So when the Great Heathen Army arrived in 865 AD, it wasn't a surprise attack. It was the inevitable conclusion of 70 years of reconnaissance. The fleet that landed in East Anglia wasn't carrying raiders anymore. It was carrying an army. Thousands of warriors. Horses. Siege equipment. Supply wagons. This wasn't a summer raid. This was an invasion, and the men leading it, the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, had a plan that would change everything. They didn't attack immediately. That's what's brilliant. King Edmund of East Anglia saw this massive force land on his shores and panicked. He offered them supplies, horses, money, anything to make them leave. The Vikings smiled, accepted everything, and promised to move on. They did move. North. Straight into the heart of Northumbria. The Northumbrian king, Ælla, finally assembled his army and marched to meet them at York. He had numbers. He had fortifications. He had every tactical advantage. And he lost anyway, because the Vikings didn't fight the way English armies expected. English warfare was ritualized. Armies met in open fields. Shield walls formed. Battle lasted until one side broke. There were rules, unwritten, but understood. You didn't attack during winter. You didn't strike civilian targets. You took noble prisoners for ransom, not slaves. Vikings had no interest in any of that. When Ælla's army approached York, the Vikings were waiting inside the old Roman walls. When the English tried to storm the gates, Vikings hit them from 3 directions simultaneously, sallying out from hidden posterns while archers rained arrows from the walls. The English formation collapsed. Ælla was captured alive, dragged before the Viking commanders, and executed in a way so brutal that English chroniclers could barely describe it. The Blood Eagle. They called it the Blood Eagle. Northumbria's king, carved apart in a pagan ritual, his death designed not just to kill him but to terrify everyone who heard about it. And it worked. Terror is a weapon, remember? When word spread of what happened to Ælla, something shifted in how England perceived these invaders. They weren't just raiders anymore. They were an existential threat. A force that didn't just want wealth, they wanted land, power, revenge. They would torture kings, defile churches, enslave populations. And they were winning. East Anglia was next. King Edmund, the same king who'd given them horses and supplies, now faced them in battle. He lost. Captured, he was given a choice: renounce Christianity and accept Viking overlordship, or die. Edmund chose death. They tied him to a tree, used him for archery practice, then beheaded him. He became a saint. His kingdom became Viking territory. 2 kingdoms down. Mercia tried to buy peace. King Burgred paid enormous sums of silver, Danegeld they called it. Protection money. The Vikings took it, left, then came back the next year demanding more. Mercia paid again. And again. Until finally, the Vikings just took the kingdom anyway, installing a puppet king who did exactly what they wanted. 3 kingdoms fallen in less than a decade. And standing alone, watching this catastrophe unfold, was Wessex. The Southern Kingdom. The last kingdom. Led by a new king who just inherited a crown that was looking more and more like a death sentence. Alfred. 21 years old. Scholarly, religious, frequently ill. Not a warrior king by nature. And now responsible for the last piece of free England with an unstoppable army marching toward him. The Vikings knew Wessex would be hardest. It was largest, richest, best organized. So they didn't attack it head-on. They chipped away. Raiding. Burning. Forcing Alfred to march his army back and forth across his kingdom, always reacting, never able to set terms of engagement. For years, Alfred held. Barely. He won some battles, lost others. Signed treaties that Vikings broke the moment it was convenient. Paid Danegeld when he had to. And slowly, agonizingly, learned how to fight an enemy that didn't follow any rules he understood. Then came January 878. 12th night. The Christian holy season. Alfred was at his royal estate in Chippenham, celebrating with his household and warriors. He had no reason to suspect attack. Winter campaigns didn't happen. It was an unspoken rule of medieval warfare. The Vikings didn't care about medieval warfare rules. They struck at midnight. Guthrum, the Viking commander who'd been camped in Wessex for months under a treaty, launched a surprise assault directly at Alfred's headquarters. No warning. No declaration. Just hundreds of warriors pouring through gates and over walls while the English scrambled for weapons in the dark. Alfred escaped. Barely. With a handful of loyal men, he fled into the winter night, leaving behind his kingdom, his crown, everything. The Vikings took Chippenham, took control of Wessex's heartland, and sent word across the kingdom: Alfred is defeated. Wessex is ours. Submit or die. Most people submitted. Can you blame them? 3 kingdoms had already fallen. Their king was in hiding. The Vikings controlled every major town, every fortification. Resistance seemed suicidal. But Alfred didn't surrender. He disappeared into the marshes of Somerset, flat, wet, impenetrable wetlands where armies couldn't follow. And there, in the cold and mud, with maybe 50 men who refused to abandon him, he did something remarkable. He started to think. See, Alfred was a scholar before he was a warrior. He'd studied, traveled, read histories of Rome and Byzantium. And hiding in those swamps, he had time to analyze 70 years of Viking success and English failure. Time to understand what was really happening. The Vikings won because they were mobile. Because they picked when and where to fight. Because they used terror as force multiplication, making enemies surrender without battle. What if he did the same thing? For months he stayed hidden. But he wasn't inactive. He sent secret messages to loyal nobles. Organized a shadow network across Wessex. Gathered intelligence on Viking positions and movements. And slowly, carefully, built not an army. He didn't have resources for that, but something else. A resistance. When he finally emerged in May 878, he didn't march on Chippenham. He called his supporters to Egbert Stone, a rallying point in Selwood Forest. And the men who came weren't professional soldiers. They were farmers with spears, blacksmiths with hammers, men who'd lost everything to Viking raids and wanted revenge. Guthrum heard Alfred was raising an army and marched to crush him at Edington. He had trained warriors, experience, numbers. Everything suggested this would be quick. But Alfred had spent months planning for this one battle. He chose the ground, controlled the timing, and most importantly, he'd learned from his enemy. The English formed their shield wall on a slope, forcing Vikings to attack uphill. When the Viking shield wall crashed into them, Alfred's men didn't try to hold position like traditional English tactics demanded. They gave ground slowly, deliberately, letting Viking momentum carry them into prepositioned flanking forces. It was a Viking tactic, used against Vikings. The battle lasted all day. The shield walls ground against each other until exhaustion became the real enemy. And when the Vikings finally broke, they didn't retreat in order. They ran. Alfred's forces pursued them all the way to their fortress at Chippenham and surrounded it. 2 weeks later, Guthrum surrendered. Not because he was defeated militarily. He still had enough men to fight. But because Alfred offered something unexpected: peace with honor. Instead of execution, Alfred offered baptism. Instead of slavery, he offered land. The northern half of England, already Viking-controlled, would officially become the Danelaw. The Vikings could settle, farm, trade. But they had to accept Alfred as overlord. Accept Christianity. Accept English law. Guthrum agreed. And to everyone's shock, he kept his word. This is the moment that changes everything. Because Alfred realized what no other English king had. You can't drive the Vikings out. They're here. They're staying. So instead of endless war, you create a system where they have a stake in peace. The Danelaw became a hybrid society, Norse and English mixing, trading, intermarrying. Towns that had been razed were rebuilt. Trade routes reopened. And Alfred used the breathing room to completely restructure Wessex's defenses. He built those fortified towns positioned so that no village in Wessex was more than 20 miles from protection. He created a rotation system for his army so he always had fresh troops. He built ships to challenge Viking naval superiority. He reformed law codes, promoted literacy, strengthened royal authority. Alfred wasn't just defending anymore. He was building something that could outlast him. But here's what's remarkable: the Viking threat didn't end. For the next 50 years, waves of raiders kept coming. New armies. New commanders. Each one thinking they could succeed where Guthrum failed. They couldn't. Because Alfred's successors, his daughter Ethelflaed, his son Edward, his grandson Athelstan, took his system and used it offensively. They didn't wait for Vikings to attack. They marched into the Danelaw and conquered it piece by piece. By 954 AD, less than a century after the Great Heathen Army landed, England was united under a single crown for the first time in history. The Viking kingdoms in the north were absorbed. Their rulers were expelled or submitted. The dream of a permanent Viking England died. Except it didn't. Not really. Because look at what England became. The language, full of Norse words. The legal system, incorporating Scandinavian customs. The culture, shaped by generations of intermarriage and exchange. Northern cities like York, built on Viking foundations. The very concept of England as a unified nation, forced into existence by the need to resist Viking invasion. And in Normandy, descendants of Vikings who'd settled in France were growing powerful. In 1066, one of them, William the Conqueror, would invade England and win the crown at Hastings. The Normans were Vikings who'd learned French. The language they brought would transform English forever. So did the Vikings conquer England? Yes and no. They conquered 3 kingdoms outright and held them for generations. They forced the English to unify or die. They shaped the culture, language, and political structure of what would become one of history's most powerful nations. But they didn't destroy England. They transformed it. Made it stronger by forcing it to adapt. By the time the Viking Age ended, England was no longer a collection of squabbling kingdoms. It was a nation with a professional army, a navy, fortified towns, and a unified identity built on surviving the greatest existential threat it had ever faced. The Vikings taught England a lesson that echoes through history. You don't defeat an enemy by being stronger. You defeat them by being smarter. By adapting. By taking what works in their tactics and making it your own. Alfred understood this. The Vikings never conquered Wessex because Alfred became what he needed to be, not a better English king, but a different kind of king. One who learned from his enemies instead of just hating them. And that's why we still remember his name 1,000 years later. Not Alfred the Strong. Not Alfred the Victorious. Alfred the Great. The king who saved England by learning from the people trying to destroy it. The shield wall that broke at Ashdown in 871 wasn't rebuilt the same way. It was rebuilt stronger. Smarter. More flexible. Built by a king who'd hidden in swamps and emerged understanding that survival requires evolution. The Vikings came to conquer. They stayed and became part of what they tried to destroy. And England, forged in the fire of that conflict, became something neither Viking nor Saxon, but something new entirely. That's the legacy. Not conquest. Transformation. The proof that civilizations don't die when they're invaded. They die when they refuse to adapt. England adapted. It survived. And it's never forgotten what it took to endure those centuries when dragon ships appeared on every horizon, and the only certainty was that summer would bring new raiders and winter would bring new fears. Stand on an English beach today and look toward the horizon. The dragon ships are gone. But the changes they forced, the language, the culture, the very shape of the nation, those remain. Written into the DNA of a country that learned the hardest way possible that the greatest threat can also be the greatest teacher. If you're willing to learn instead of just fight. If you're willing to adapt instead of just resist. If you're willing to become something new instead of clinging to what you were. That's how you survive an invasion. That's how you conquer conquerors. Not by defeating them in battle, though that helps, but by absorbing what made them dangerous and becoming stronger for it. The Vikings conquered England, and England conquered them right back.